Irene Garza was born on November 15, 1934, to Nicholas and Josephina in McAllen, Texas. She was a majorette in her high school band and was crowned the Miss All-South Texas Sweetheart in 1958. She then studied at Pan American College, where she was named Homecoming Queen. In 1960, 25-year-old Irene was a second-grade school teacher at Thigpen Elementary School, still living with her parents. On April 16, 1960, she went to confession at the Sacred Heart Church and then strangely disappeared. When she failed to return home, her parents assumed she had stayed for the Easter Vigil Mass. However, by 3 a.m., when there was still no sign of her, they called the police and reported her missing. Police began searching for her and discovered her car near the church. They also questioned parishioners at the church, and they recalled seeing her that night. 2 days later, on April 18th, a person driving down McAllen Road found her purse, left shoe, and lace veil. This led to a massive search of the area, the largest in Rio Grande Valley's history. Unfortunately, a woman claiming to be Irene called her parents and said she had been kidnapped and taken to a hotel in nearby Hidalgo. It turned out to be a hoax. Then a man in Edinburgh told a waitress that he murdered Irene, but it was just a cruel joke from a very drunk individual. 5 days after she went missing, her body was discovered floating in an irrigation canal several miles from where her purse and other items were found. She was fully dressed, but her shoes and underwear were missing, and her blouse was unbuttoned. The medical examiner determined that she had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and suffocated to death. They then drained the canal looking for more evidence and found a green photo slide viewer. To their surprise, Father John Fite, who was 27 years old at the time, sent police a note saying the photo slide viewer was his. Fite was also the person who heard Irene's last confession. While investigators questioned over 500 people, the only solid suspect was Fite, but there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime besides the photo slide viewer. The case would then go unsolved for many years until it was reopened in 2002. That's when 2 clergymen named Father Dale Ticini and Father Joseph O'Brien came forward and said that Fite had confessed to murdering her shortly after the crime. Fite had remained a priest until the 70s when he left, married, and started a family. In 2004, the DA brought the case in front of a grand jury, but Fite was not indicted. In 2015, with a new DA in office, they renewed the investigation into Irene's murder. It was discovered that back in 1961, investigators had questioned members of the church and said that on the night of Irene's disappearance, the line for confession was slower than usual. They also noted that Fite was away from the church several times that night. The next day, fellow priests noticed he had scratch marks on his hands. They also found it strange that he had taken Irene to the church rectory for confession instead of the confessional. When questioned about this, he denied the accusation, but later admitted that he had taken her to the rectory. He was then given a polygraph, and they said he passed. However, years later, it was revealed that the tests were actually inconclusive. When asked where he went that night, he said he left the sanctuary because he had broken his glasses and drove back to the church's pastoral house to get another pair. He said when he arrived, he had no key, so he climbed into the house on the 2nd floor, and that's where the scratches on his hands came from. 3 weeks before Irene's death, a woman named Maria Guerra was assaulted while kneeling at the communion rail at another Catholic church in the area. She eventually fought off her attacker and said the man looked like a priest from the Catholic Church in Edinburgh, Texas. When rumors began spreading that Fite was responsible, local church leaders covered it up and insisted that a priest could never be involved in a violent crime. While Fite denied attacking Maria, he did admit to being at the church that day. After Irene's murder, Maria picked Fite out of a police lineup as the man who had attacked her. In 1961, Father Fite stood trial in Austin, charged with assault with intent to sexually assault, but the trial ended in a deadlocked jury. Rather than face another trial, he later pleaded no contest to a lesser charge of aggravated assault and was fined $500. Fite claimed he did not understand that a no contest plea would be considered a conviction in the case. Fite was then sent to Assumption Abbey, a Trappist monastery in Missouri. An abbot at Assumption Abbey told monk Dale Tacheny that Fite had killed someone and asked Tacheny to cancel Fite for a few months to determine whether he had the disposition to become a monk. Tacheny said that Fite confessed to hurting a young lady and murdering another one, but he said it was not his job to judge him at the time. He then kept the secret to himself until 2002. Since Fite did not enjoy the lifestyle at Assumption Abbey, he was sent to a treatment retreat for troubled priests in Jemez Springs, New Mexico. He then became a staff member and eventually worked his way into a supervisor role. While there, he cleared known child abuser Father James Porter, who went on to abuse more than 100 children and was later arrested and sentenced to prison for those crimes. Finally, in February 2016, 83-year-old Fite was arrested and charged with her murder. At the time, he was living in Arizona and had to be extradited back to Texas. On December 7, 2017, 57 years after her brutal murder, Fite was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. However, he wouldn't be in prison long because he died of natural causes in February 2020. Karen Sue Klaas was born Karen O'Grady on April 22, 1943, in Independence, Missouri. In 1961, she graduated from Santa Ana Senior High School, and then 2 years later, in 1963, she met Bill Medley, who co-founded the Righteous Brothers, and by 1964, they were married. They had one son together, but the marriage wouldn't last, and they divorced in 1967. She then married Gerald Klaas, and they also had a son together. In 1976, 32-year-old Karen was living with her sons in Hermosa Beach, California, and had recently broken her leg and had a cast on it. On January 30, 1976, Karen was supposed to meet some of her neighbors for coffee after taking her youngest child to the McMartin preschool in Manhattan Beach, but never showed up. At the time, her oldest son was with his father, Bill. After failing to show up, they tried calling her, but there was no answer. So they went by her home, entered through the rear door, and called out for her, but received no response. So they walked around to the front of the house and saw a man with bushy, curly brown hair leaving. They became terrified after realizing he matched the description of a man seen loitering around the neighborhood that week. After calling the police, Karen was found on the floor, nude and unconscious. She was rushed to the hospital and remained in a coma until she died on February 3rd. An autopsy determined she had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled to death. They also determined that she was murdered after returning home around 9 a.m. and that the suspect was likely inside waiting on her. Thankfully, they were able to collect evidence that would later be used for DNA testing, but the case would still go unsolved for the next 41 years. In 2016, the DNA was sent off for forensic genetic genealogy and produced a potential suspect. With further investigative work, detectives were led to a man by the name of Kenneth Eugene Troyer, who was 29 years old at the time of the murder. However, he would never be arrested because he died in a shootout with police in 1982 after escaping from a California men's colony state prison in St. Louis Obispo. At the time, he was behind bars for burglary, but was suspected of committing multiple sexual assaults and robberies in Orange County. Thankfully, the Orange County Coroner's Office had a sample of his DNA that was used to make the connection. Adam Chrismer was born on August 25, 1985, in Walker County, Georgia. When he was younger, he met Samantha Lynn Leming, and by the time she was 16 and Adam was 17, they were married. After the wedding, Adam and Samantha moved into a trailer on Mohawk Road in Rossville, Georgia. In 2002, the same year they married, they met 51-year-old Howard Hawk Willis. Willis was a trucker out of Georgia who was out on bond after an arrest in New York for smuggling cocaine from Texas to Brooklyn. Unfortunately, this would be the biggest mistake of their lives. They all three became friends and were regular visitors at his mother Betty's home in Johnson City, Tennessee throughout 2002. However, by October of that year, the teens strangely went missing. They were last seen on October 4th, 2002, at a Pizza Hut in Chattanooga, where Samantha's mother lived. They were being driven by Willis in Betty's red Jeep. After that day, she was never able to get in touch with her daughter again. That same day, Adam called his mother, who was also familiar with Willis at this point, crying and asking to come home. Just like Samantha's mom, she never heard from her son again after that day. On or about October 7th or 8th, Miss Chrismer received a phone call from a Bradley County detective who was looking for Adam to question him about Willis's stepfather, Samuel Thomas's disappearance. She knew at that moment something bad had happened. In the meanwhile, she had been trying to call Adam on the number he gave her, but no one answered, so she left a message. Willis finally called her back, and she asked where Adam was. He told her the last time he saw Adam was at his trailer in Rossville. During the conversation, she could hear two women in the background talking, and Willis was trying to get them to shut up. She noted that during the conversation, he was very calm and acted like nothing was wrong. Willis was scheduled to meet with law enforcement in Bradley County on October 4th, 2002, but called and said he couldn't make it. When he arrived on October 8th, 2002, they asked if he knew where Adam and Samantha were. He said he hadn't seen them since the 4th and thought they were possibly at their home in Georgia. At that point, they began suspecting he was involved in their disappearance. On October 10th, 2002, they arrested Willis on federal drug charges at his aunt's home in Johnson City. Once in jail that day, they recorded a conversation between him and his mother, Betty, where she referred to a storage unit, and Willis quickly told her to shut up. Investigators began calling around and found that Betty had rented Unit X47 at the 24-hour self-storage facility in Johnson City, Tennessee. Officers went to the unit, but it was padlocked. However, they could smell the scent of decay. After obtaining a search warrant and opening the unit, they sadly found Adam and Samantha's bodies. They were found inside 50-gallon plastic totes and had been dead for a few days. Some of Adam's remains were missing and later found by a fisherman during a fishing tournament on Boone Lake. Investigators determined that Willis cut up Adam with a chainsaw in order to fit him in the Rubbermaid container. It's believed that Adam was murdered first, between October 6th and October 8th. As for Samantha, they estimate her death between October 7th and October 9th. On October 17th, 2002, they searched his mother Betty's home and found a box of Winchester .32 caliber ammunition in an attached garage. It matched the same bullets that were used to kill Adam and Samantha. They also described her house as having a foul odor with flies and larvae present. Plus, the carpet had been ripped up. A few days later, they discovered the remains of his stepfather, Sam. After being arrested, his ex-wife, Wilda, went to the police station at 9 p.m. and spoke with detectives. It was during that conversation that they agreed to work together to try and get a confession recorded. She then went to the jail and met with Willis and recorded him giving her directions to a chainsaw that was used during the crime. The chainsaw was ultimately found along Interstate 75 in Bradley County. On the second visit with him, she recorded him confessing to the murders. He claimed the reason he murdered them was because Adam robbed and murdered his stepfather, Sam, who had disappeared in early September 2002. Investigators believe it's possible that all three were involved in the murder of Thomas because they were caught on a business surveillance camera using one of his credit cards after he disappeared. They believe the teens were hanging around Willis because he was giving them drugs in exchange for sex. During Willis's trial, Betty's neighbor, Wilma Clay, testified that she saw Willis, his daughter, Kelly, along with Adam and Samantha between April and September of 2002. After September, she never saw them again. On October 5th, 2002, Wilma went outside to smoke and saw Willis standing outside next to her mother's red Jeep, also smoking. When he was finished, he grabbed a black plastic bag from the back of the Jeep and threw it on the ground. When she came back out later, she saw the garage closed with the light on, which she said was unusual. It's believed this is when he was taking care of Adam's body. On June 21, 2010, Willis was found guilty of 2 counts of premeditated first-degree murder and 1 count of felony murder in perpetration of kidnapping and was sentenced to death. He's also a suspect in the disappearance of his first wife, Deborah Willis, who went missing on December 23, 1986. As for his mother, Betty, aka Emma Elizabeth Hawk, she was arrested and charged with corpse abuse, accessory to first-degree murder, and attempting to tamper with evidence. However, she would never be convicted because she died in 2009 at the age of 78. His aunt, 74-year-old Marie Hawk Holmes, was also charged with an attempt to tamper with evidence. It's alleged that she tried to convince Wilda to destroy the tape recording of Willis's confession. All the charges against her were later dismissed, and she passed away in 2011. Willis has tried to get a new trial, but those attempts have been denied, and as of 2024, he remains on death row. Steve Guerra was born on July 23, 1964, and grew up in Kingsburg, California. He was a student at Kingsburg High School and was a member of the school's wrestling team and also played football his freshman year. By 1989, 24-year-old Steve was a single father raising his 1-year-old daughter, Sasha, and working as a construction foreman. Sadly, all that would be taken away from him. On April 8, 1989, Steve and his girlfriend Deanna Daniels were heading back to the Break Room bar in Visalia so Deanna could get her car when a truck came up behind them near Murray Avenue and Willis Street, flashing their headlights and honking the horn. After pulling into the bar's parking lot, Steve got out and asked the driver what he needed. All of a sudden, the driver, Jason Alvarez, slammed his door open and hit Steve, and the passenger, Elio Benaventi, came around and attacked him. During the fight between all 3 men, Steve was stabbed multiple times. After the murder, the men fled the scene, and Deanna tried to stop them by unsuccessfully lunging for the keys inside. Steve was rushed to the hospital, where he was sadly pronounced dead on arrival. 4 hours later, the truck was found about 4 blocks away with Jason dead inside. Apparently, Elio had accidentally stabbed him during the altercation. Elio's father, Juan Benaventi, brought his son to the police station for an interview, but they were unaware that he was involved in the murders, so they never had Deanna come down and identify him. I also read that they knew he was involved but lacked the evidence to arrest him. However, I feel like if that was true, they would have had Deanna come down and identify him through a police lineup. Regardless, after the interview, he was released. Days later, when the fingerprint results from the knife came back, they matched Elio, and a warrant was put out for his arrest. However, he was nowhere to be found. Steve's mother, Marlene, and his daughter, Sasha, would spend the next 27 years seeking justice. In 2016, police tracked Elio down in Mexico with the help of Mexican law enforcement. Once he was in custody, authorities in Mexico walked him to the border in El Paso, Texas, and handed him over to U.S. law enforcement. He was then charged with the murders of Steve and Jason. In the end, he was convicted and sentenced to 14 years in prison. I was not able to find the reason behind the initial argument between Steve and Jason. Maybe it was a road rage incident, or maybe Steve encountered Jason earlier in the night. Sadly, Deanna experienced another loss in her life in 2009 when her husband of 3 years died in a motorcycle accident. Then, on June 1, 2019, she died due to an accident in her home. Susan Arlene Winters was born on March 14, 1966, in Altus, Oklahoma. In 1984, she graduated from Blanchard High School and then went on to study political science at the University of Oklahoma. After graduating in 1987, she enrolled in law school and obtained her law degree in 1990. She began practicing law in Oklahoma City before working in the DA's office in Clark County, Nevada. After that, she went back to practicing private law in Nevada. By 2015, 48-year-old Susan had been married to Dr. Gregory Brent Dennis, a psychologist who went by his middle name, for 20 years and was living in Henderson, Nevada, with her 2 daughters. Unfortunately, her marriage to Brent was not all it was made out to be, and in January 2015, everything would come crumbling down. On January 3rd, Brent called 911, saying that he found Susan unconscious. During the call, he handed the phone to his daughter so he could perform CPR. Once emergency services arrived, she was rushed to the hospital in critical condition and placed on life support. Strangely, there were no external injuries except for a mark on her nose, which could have occurred during CPR. Since Susan had a DNR, which means do not resuscitate, she was taken off life support and died. When the toxicology report came back, it showed high levels of ethylene glycol, the main active ingredient in antifreeze, plus there was oxycodone and Xanax in her system. Brent was brought in for questioning and said that Susan had been depressed and had talked about taking her own life. He said on the day he found her unconscious, he took the girls shopping to get them out of the house, and when he returned at 10:30 p.m., he found her asleep with the laptop nearby. He claimed that he saw a search about using antifreeze to kill yourself. Believing she was passed out from drinking, he unsuccessfully tried to wake her. That's when he claims he called 911. The couple's daughters also confirmed Susan's state of mind. After the medical examiner received the toxicology report, he ruled that she took her own life using oxycodone, Xanax, and ethylene glycol. The case was then subsequently closed. Thankfully, her parents didn't believe the ruling and decided to hire a team of private investigators to look into the case. They couldn't get past the fact that Susan was not prescribed oxycodone and didn't know how she got access to it. The first thing the private investigators did was question Brent as to why he took Susan off life support so quickly and then had her cremated once she died, which loved ones didn't find out about until her funeral on January 9th. His explanation for the cremation was that he injured her nose while trying to resuscitate her. At that point, the private investigators knew they needed to put Brent under constant surveillance. So they spent 15 hours a day, 7 days a week watching him. During that time, they observed him traveling to an area of Las Vegas known for prostitution and drug activity. He was also spending time at the Orleans Hotel and Casino. They watched as he took an elevator to the upper floor of the hotel, returning 10 minutes later. They theorized that he was getting drugs from someone at the casino several times a week and sometimes twice a day. They had also witnessed him doing drugs in a car in a parking lot. If all this was true, he had a very expensive drug habit. Now they had a possible motive, money. So they looked into the couple's financials and discovered that Susan had an insurance policy. Brent had even reached out to the company to make sure it would pay even if she took her own life. That insurance policy ultimately paid $1 million. He had also drained $180,000 from her personal bank account. Equipped with the new evidence, they went to a civil attorney but were told they needed even more proof. So investigators went to great lengths to discover the name of the person he was visiting at the hotel. That person turned out to be Jeffrey Crosby, who had a prior conviction of drug trafficking. Once the civil attorney, Tony Segro, was on board, a wrongful death suit was filed. Segro then submitted a subpoena to get their computer, and based on the timestamps from the search history for antifreeze, it was determined that Brent, not Susan, performed the internet searches. During the civil trial, Brent took the stand and was asked if Susan had threatened to expose his drug use 2 to 3 days before her death, but he responded that he had no clear memory of that.
She said she was going to turn you in for using drugs. Fair?
I don't have any recollection of that.
What statements did she use when she threatened to discuss your drug use with the board that supervises you?
Honestly, I don't recall any threat of that nature.
You just told me.
She made general threat. Go ahead.
While he was forthcoming about his drug use, he was unaware that private investigators had caught him on camera getting the drugs. They had also obtained proof that Susan tried to call the drug dealer herself a couple of days before she died. She was most likely trying to figure out the details of her husband's drug use. Given some of the details that emerged during the deposition, the Henderson Police Department decided to reopen the case and assigned a new detective. That detective determined from Brent's cell phone records that he contacted Crosby the night Susan died and had gone to the hotel. It's believed that's where the oxycodone came from. They also learned that Brent was buying medication from his patients. Because of this, they believe he murdered Susan because he was afraid that a divorce would reveal his drug use and cause him to lose his medical license, ultimately destroying his life. The Clark County Coroner's Office re-reviewed the evidence and changed her cause of death to undetermined instead of taking her own life. Brent was then arrested and charged with Susan's murder on February 2, 2017, 2 years after she died. In the end, he pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and was sentenced to 3 to 10 years in prison. Unfortunately, he will be eligible for parole next year on May 4, 2025.